Hi everyone, how's it going? Here to talk a little bit more about evolution. We've been talking about evolution and natural selection, and we've been talking about, all the sources of evidence that support this idea. And so in this lecture, we'll kind of pull some of that together and talk about some more interesting things. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of life on Earth. And within this, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the physical evidence that supports this idea of evolution by natural selection. And I like to talk about this topic because I think that it's one of those things that it's one of those sort of mental stumbling blocks that sometimes people have when they're trying to comprehend this idea that all current life evolved from earlier life and all life has evolved from earlier, more simple organisms. When you talk about the basic idea of natural selection, it makes perfect sense, and you look at all these things that support that, but yet still it's like, wow, this is a really heavy idea. And I think that one of the things that is sort of a mental stumbling block is that we need to really think about exactly how long this has been going on, and this concept of deep time and the age of the Earth. And that's what I want to talk about in a little bit today. And so, just like we said, artificial selection can lead to very different organisms in a fairly short time. By the same logic, natural selection can also lead to very different organisms. It just takes a lot longer. And so we need a way to wrap our heads around how long has this been going on, and then briefly talk a little bit about what, how things evolved and what does the history of Earth look like. And so we're just going to kind of, again, this is a 101 class, so we're going to take the 10,000 foot view. But I'm going to try and hit the highlights and what I think are the most interesting aspects of this concept. And so the first thing I want to talk about is radiometric dating. So we're sort of getting back into more of the evidence thing. What's some of the physical evidence that supports some of these ideas? And then we'll briefly talk about the history of life on Earth. We're going to spend most of our time talking about radiometric dating, though. And so when we talk about history of life and the age of the universe and the age of Earth, what kind of numbers am I talking about here? And so I'm going to ask yourself, here's a simple question. How old is the universe? So we're talking about how long ago was the Big Bang? We think the Big Bang was when all matter was condensed into a small package, and then it exploded. So how long ago did that happen? 1 to 2 million years, 1 to 2 billion years, 5 to 10 billion years, 11 to 15 billion years? What do you think? Or what do have you ever heard about this before? Well, our best estimate is between 11 to 15 billion years, about 13.8 billion years ago. So that's when the universe formed. That's when the Big Bang occurred. Same question, how old then is the Earth? 1 to 2 million years, 1 to 2 billion years, 4 to 5 billion years, or 8 to 10 billion years. So the Earth was not formed during the Big Bang. The Earth formed later. How much later? Well, several billion years later. The Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. And so that's still a crazy long amount of time and hard to fathom. But again, I want you to kind of wrap your brain around this, that 13 or 14, there's some sort of bug attacking me, 13 or 14 billion years ago is when the universe, all the galaxies that formed. But then several billion years elapsed before the Earth formed, about 4.6 billion years ago. And so then once the Earth formed, when did life appear? How long has there been life on Earth? 1 to 2 million years, 1 to 2 billion years, 3 to 4 billion years, or 4 to 5 billion years. So again, we'll try to get the relative scale here. Well, our best estimate is about 3.8 billion years. And so that's when the first life evolved, and then things have been evolving ever since then to get to the modern day. And so these are numbers that, at first glance, it's really hard to wrap your head around, but that's kind of what we're going to work with today. And so just to reiterate, the universe was formed during the Big Bang about 13.8 billion years ago. So when you see BYA, that's billion years ago. And then things had to cool down and start to come together and form planets and other celestial bodies. And so our solar system, the Earth, formed about 4.6 billion years ago. And then about 3.8 billion years ago is when we find the oldest fossils, and that's our best estimate of when life evolved. And so I mentioned this term earlier, deep time. And so thinking about things on this level is often called deep time. It's just time on a scale much different than what we're used to. And so on some level, it's hard for our primate brains to understand things at this scale because we've evolved on a much shorter time scale. But then again, we look at things on big scales all the time, right? If you think of a globe, right? A globe is a representation of the Earth, and you can comprehend that, but that globe is, on a very, very different scale than the Earth. And so it's possible for us to understand things, at a very different scale. We just need to kind of train our brains to think that way. And so, these numbers, again, in my evolution class, we spent a lot of time talking about these numbers and all the different ways that we've studied how old is the universe and how old is the Earth and how old is life and all the different lines of evidence and pulled them all together. And consistently, these are the numbers that we get. So how do we come up with such estimates? Well, we could talk a lot about that, but I'm going to give you one example. Now, we're going to deviate from biology for a little bit. And you've probably noticed this already. When we talk about evolution, we talk about a lot of things other than just straight biology, right? And to really understand evolution, you need to understand geology and astronomy and physics and chemistry and math. And you don't need to be an expert in any of those, but you need to be aware of them and understand them a little bit, and to take things from those other disciplines and synthesize them to help understand evolution. And you remember we talked about Darwin, and he read a lot of books, from geologists, and in this class we talked about chemistry in a lot of detail. So to really understand these things, you've got to understand these other scientific disciplines and pull from them. And so that's kind of what we're going to do with this first topic. And so, for example, when we come up with things like how old is the universe? How do we estimate the age of the universe? That's a classic astronomy question, an astrophysics question. And I'm not an astrophysicist, right? But I understand the basic idea. And the basic idea is that we can measure the rate of expansion of the universe. And this is what we do with things like the Hubble telescope and other things that NASA does. And when we look at other galaxies, we see they're all moving away from us. And they're moving away at different rates based upon how far away they are. And how do you measure how fast a galaxy is moving? Well, you can look at the Doppler effect, and you can look at the shift in the wavelengths of energy that you're measuring from those galaxies. And if all the galaxies were formed during the Big Bang, then that would explain why everything is all moving away from us. And if we measure how fast things are moving away from us, then we can work backwards into when all these things were in one area, in one spot. And so by measuring how fast things are moving away, we can work backwards to figure out, well, when was everything in the same area? That was the Big Bang. That's when the universe formed. And so that's just an example of how we can use data that we collect to estimate something that happened a long, long time ago. Now, again, I don't pretend that I'm an astrophysicist and I could describe to you exactly how this happens, but that is the idea. That is the exact idea of how we can take these data and make predictions and work backwards to get an estimate like the universe is 13.8 billion years old. Now, as a biologist, and we're talking about evolution, we're going to talk about things that happened more recently, like the formation of the planet and then the formation of life on Earth. And, you know, we can't really use movement of other galaxies for that, but we use other techniques. And so we have lots of ways that we try to estimate the age of things here on Earth. And the one that we've already mentioned is like with fossils. You know, if we want to estimate how old fossils are, we've already talked about how you can get the relative age of fossils. That the deeper the fossil, the older it is. And so that tells you that some fossils are older than other fossils, and so we get a relative age. But what we're talking about, when we put an actual age on the Earth or an actual age on a fossil, we're talking about the absolute age, not the relative age. And one of the best ways to do that is through radiometric dating. And so using chemistry and physics and our understanding of the atom to age things. And big picture, radioactive atoms decay at a known rate. And if we measure the radioactive atoms in a rock or in a fossil, and we know the rate at which they decay, then we can work backwards to find out how old that rock or fossil is. And that's how we can get an estimate of the absolute age. And that's the basic idea. But let's talk about some of the details here to kind of flesh this out a little. So to do radiometric dating, we need isotopes. We need radioactive isotopes. And so what is an isotope? Now we're back to our chemistry, right? It's an atom that has too many neutrons. Now what do you mean by too many? You know, an atypical number, you know, a different number of neutrons than you typically find in that atom. And so for example, carbon-14 is a radioactive isotope of carbon. And it has too many neutrons, or it has more neutrons than the typical carbon that we find. And so let's go back to our chemistry a little bit, because we need to understand this idea and refresh this idea so we can understand what I'm talking about. And so here's the periodic table entry for carbon. And so we can use this to figure out how many protons, how many neutrons, and how many electrons a typical carbon atom has, right? And so that's my question here. How many protons, neutrons, and electrons does a typical carbon atom have based on this periodic table entry? Well, you'll remember that the atomic number tells you how many protons an atom has. And a typical atom is neutral, doesn't have a charge. And so the number of protons equals the number of electrons. So you get the positive and the negative charges balancing each other out. And then the atomic weight tells you the number of protons and the number of neutrons. And so carbon has 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons, right? The atomic number is 6. That tells you that it has 6 protons. Any atom that has 6 protons is a carbon atom. That's how you tell one atom from another. It doesn't have a charge on it, so if you've got 6 protons which have a positive charge, you need 6 electrons which have a negative charge. So that's how we know how many electrons we have. And you see the atomic weight is around 12, and so that tells you the number of protons and neutrons. And so if the atomic weight is 12 and I know I have 6 protons, then I must have 6 neutrons. Now, why is the atomic weight not a whole number? Well, it's because of these isotopes that we're going to talk about. And so most carbon is carbon-12. Most, based on the periodic table entry, most carbon has 6 protons, 6 electrons, and 6 neutrons. So its atomic weight is 6 protons plus 6 neutrons. 6 plus 6 is 12. That's why we call it carbon-12. All right? And that's a low energy state. That's an energetically stable molecule. It's not going to, it's very unlikely that it's going to change into anything else. That's why most carbon is carbon-12. But sometimes there are some carbon atoms that have 6 protons. That's how we know it's a carbon, right? If it's got 6 protons, it has to be a carbon. But it has 8 neutrons. So 6 plus 8 is 14. The atomic weight of those carbon atoms is 14. It's called carbon-14, and that's an isotope. And so here we are just reiterating what I said earlier about the periodic table, is that the atomic number tells you the number of protons and the number of electrons. The atomic mass tells you the number of protons and the number of neutrons. And so this is, for lack of a better word, a typical atom, or it's an atom that's at a low energy state. So carbon-14 is an isotope of carbon-12. It's got more neutrons than a typical carbon atom. Now, the thing about isotopes is they tend to be less stable. Some are stable, and some are, fine, but lots of isotopes are unstable, which means their nucleus is not held together well. So you've got all those neutrons and protons in the nucleus. It's these stink bugs that are attacking me. That's what's attacking me tonight. You've got all these neutrons and protons in the nucleus, and they're packed together, and they're, atomic nuclear forces that hold them together. And when you get the proper mix of those, you have an energetically stable nucleus, and it's unlikely to change. But if you have a couple of extra neutrons, that disrupts that, and it's not quite as stable as your typical nucleus. And so it's unstable, it's at a high energy state. And so, for example, in carbon-14, those 2 extra neutrons really mess up this delicate balance of forces. 6 protons and 6 neutrons, man, they pack together, and that just happens to be a nice energy state, and you got nice stable carbon-12. You add a couple extra neutrons to that, they don't have a charge, but they have a mass, and they're tucked in there, and it just messes up. It's like things can't stack together as nicely as you would like them. And so that nucleus is a little bit unstable. And so that means it's at a high energy state, and that it will spontaneously go to a low energy state at some point. And how is it going to go to this lower energy state? Well, just get rid of those neutrons, or convert those neutrons. Do something with those neutrons. Those 2 extra neutrons are messing up this nucleus and making it unstable. And so if something happens to those neutrons, you get rid of them, or you convert them, or you do something, then you can go to a low energy state and make a nice stable molecule. And that is what radioactive decay is. It's when this unstable nucleus changes to go to a lower energy state. And so that's what radioactive atoms are. Not just carbon-14, but any radioactive isotope. It's got an unstable nucleus, and so they want to shed protons, or they want to shed neutrons, or they want to convert something. They want something to happen to convert that nucleus to a lower energy state. So here's an example of carbon and it decaying, right? And so here we've got carbon-14, this radioactive version of carbon. Excuse me. I'm very nervous about these stink bugs. They keep attacking me. And so remember, that carbon-14 nucleus is unstable. It wants to get to a more stable energy state because it's got extra neutrons, and that just messes up the forces that hold together the nucleus. And so what happens? A neutron gets converted to a proton. Right? So some molecules, some radioactive molecules will kick off the neutrons, and some will convert the neutrons, or some maybe even will spit out a proton. But in this example, carbon-14, one of those extra neutrons converts to a proton. And so that's one of the things that, comes with your chemistry and your physics classes is, what are the properties of these things that make up the atom, and how can they convert to one another? But they can, okay? And so one of those extra neutrons gets converted to a proton. Now, if you change the number of protons, you change the atom, right? So now if you have 7 protons, you had 6, right? You were a carbon atom with 6 protons, but you took this extra neutron and converted it to a proton. Now you have 7 protons, you're a different atom. That's a nitrogen atom, not a carbon atom anymore. And so now you've got 7 protons and 7 neutrons. You started with carbon that had 6 protons, and it was an isotope, so it had 8 neutrons. You took one of the neutrons, converted it to a proton, now you've got 7 protons, 7 neutrons. Well, that is a nitrogen atom, and nitrogen atoms are a stable molecule, or stable atom. And so by converting one of those extra neutrons to a proton, you've gone from a high energy state to a low energy state. So you had that radioactive molecule has changed, and now it's at a stable state. Now, of course, and this is what I'm saying here, originally had 6 protons and 8 neutrons, but one of those neutrons spontaneously converts to a proton. Now you're at 7,7, which is plain old nitrogen. And so you went from radioactive carbon to nitrogen. And so why did this happen spontaneously? Because radioactive carbon was a high energy state. Those neutrons and protons were just not quite in a good balance. But by converting a neutron to a proton, now you're at a lower energy state. But first law of thermodynamics says that energy has to go somewhere. Right? You can't, if you go from a high energy state to a low energy state, you have to lose some energy. That energy just can't disappear. And so what happens in this instance is an electron is formed and an electron is ejected. And so that electron takes a little bit of that extra energy with it. That's how you go from this high energy state to a low energy state, because you kick off some energy. Well, again, this is what happens with all radioactive atoms. They're at a high energy state, they're unstable, they do something to convert to a lower energy state, but that energy's got to go somewhere, and so they shed that energy. Well, that's why radioactive atoms can be used to make power plants, or maybe even to make bombs, or why some radioactive molecules you don't want to hold because they're shooting energy out that's destroying your DNA. But this is the basic idea of radioactive decay. And so the carbon-14 will decay down to nitrogen. And so that's why we call it radioactive decay. It's decay because it's losing energy. It's going from a high energy state to a low energy state. Carbon-14 is what we call the parent atom, and nitrogen is what we call the daughter atom. And so in radioactive isotopes, start out, they're the parent atom, and then they will always decay down to a daughter atom. And so it might be the same element, but with a different number of neutrons. It might change to a different element, like what happened here. There's all kinds of possibilities, and this is what you would talk about in your chemistry and your physics classes. But the idea is that we know that isotopes do this. Not all isotopes. Some isotopes are stable and they won't really decay, but lots of isotopes are unstable. And that's what I'm just saying here. And so there's lots of different ways that radioactive isotope can decay down to the daughter atoms, right? We just saw carbon-14 converted a neutron to a proton and kicked off an electron. Sometimes they'll just kick off the neutron, just get rid of it. Sometimes, there's lots of other different ways that you can convert from a isotope to a different isotope or to a different atom. This is just one example of that. Okay, so that's what radioactive decay is. And it turns out that this is a nice, steady process, that we can figure out how quickly these atoms will decay. We can't predict which particular isotope is going to decay, but we can predict how many are going to decay in a unit time. It's a nice, steady rate. And that's why we can use radioactive isotopes to estimate the age of things, because we know how quickly these radioactive atoms will change. So for example, carbon-14, its half-life is about 5,715 years. So every 5,715 years, half of a sample of carbon-14 converts to nitrogen. And then in another 5,715 years, half of that remaining amount converts. So for example, let's say that I started with 1,000 atoms of carbon-14 today. In 5,715 years, I would have 500 atoms of carbon-14, and I would have 500 atoms of nitrogen. And then 5,715 years from then, 11,000 years from today, I would have 250 atoms of carbon-14 and 750 atoms of nitrogen. And so physicists and chemists have figured this out for lots of these isotopes. And so we can look at the relative amount of radioactive atoms in a sample, and if we know this half-life, we can work backwards and we can figure out when was that sample formed. And so like I said, there's lots of different radioactive isotopes, lots of different atoms that do this. And carbon is very useful for younger things. So more recent living things. But for older stuff, and for things like the age of the Earth, stuff that's really, really old, carbon's no good because its half-life is too short. We use other elements that have a very long half-life, like uranium and lead and rubidium and strontium and all these other ones. Okay, so here's a table from another book I have. This is not from your book, this is from a different book I have. And it just shows examples of some of the different elements that are used to do radiometric dating. And so for younger things, you want something with a relatively short half-life, like carbon-14. That's a relatively short half-life. But for older stuff, you want to use something like uranium-235. If you look at uranium-235, it decays down to lead-207, and its half-life is 700 million years. And you've got some of these other things that their half-lives are measured in the billions of years. But those are useful for figuring out things like the age of the Earth or very old rocks and stuff like that. So that's the basic idea. So how do I use this to age a fossil? Well, I look at the ratio of isotopes to stable atoms. And so I can measure how much of each type of atom is in a sample. How much are the isotope and how much are a different kind of stable atom. I know the half-life, so then I can just work backwards. And so this is a figure from your book, kind of showing you roughly this idea, right? And so you can see this decay curve for a particular atom. And so if you start with 100%, if you have a sample that has 100% of this radioactive isotope, and then after one half-life, you only have 50% of that radioactive isotope. After two half-lives, you only have 25%, and so on, okay? And so if you take a sample, and it has 19% of the original amount of radioactivity in there, then you know that would be about 2.5 half-lives based on this particular element. And so that sample is about 2.5 million years old. So there's a lot more to this, but this is the basic idea, is that by knowing how much of the radioactive isotope you have and knowing how quickly it decays, you can work backwards to when that rock was formed, or that fossil was formed, or that planet was formed. And that's how we can get the estimate the age of things like the Earth and fossils and other organisms and other things, other structures that we find in the ground, right? And so, the question that we often get is, well, how can you know all this, right? How could you know all this about isotopes? I mean, again, you can't see an isotope. You can't see a neutron or a proton. How can we estimate these half-lives? 700 million years. You can't measure something over 700 million years. How can we take samples from rocks and know that we can use this to make those ages? And we can't directly observe any of those, but we can use the scientific method. We can make predictions, and then we can conduct experiments to test those predictions. And then we can take what we've learned from those predictions, and we can create other hypotheses, and we can constantly test hypotheses. And so by using the scientific method, we have figured out the structure of the atom, and we're able to figure out a lot of these things. Even though we can't directly observe them, we can make predictions, and those predictions are held up by the physical evidence. So we can use the scientific method, and that's how we can make these calculations and make these claims. Now here I got another question for you. So around 1940, we start to see changes in these isotope ratios. So if you study things about 80 years ago, we start to notice that you see changes in those isotopic signatures. Now why? Why did we see changes 80 years ago? Is it because the rate of isotope creation increased? Is it because climate changed, influenced the rate of radioactive decay? Is it because our instruments just got better around then? Does it have something to do with solar flares? What do you think? Well, the answer is A. The rate of isotope creation increased. So, why all of a sudden do we see that more isotopes are being created? That seems like an odd thing, and why in 1940? Well, think about your history. That's when scientists started to figure out the structure of the atom. That's when we started to figure out how to split atoms and how to build things like atomic bombs and nuclear power generators, right? And we started figuring out, based upon science and based upon our hypotheses and testing our predictions, we figured out the structure of the atom, and that how can we use that to unleash that energy and in the process create these other radioactive isotopes. And it's the same science that allows us to make atomic bombs and nuclear energy that also teaches us about half-lives and then tells us that we can use those half-lives and those isotopes to age rocks. And so it's all the same. It's all based upon our understanding of the structure of an atom. And that was all derived from using the scientific method. So again, even though we can't directly observe these things, we can make predictions, and I think you would agree with me that we do have a pretty good understanding of the structure of the atom. Well, with that same logic, we can apply this to rocks and fossils and figure out how old these rocks are and how old the Earth is. Okay, so that's one source of information on how we determine how long this has been going on and how old these things are. And so let's talk a little bit about the history of life and how things have evolved over time. Now again, there's lots of details here. We could spend a ton of time talking about this, but we're just going to get a quick overview because I think it's interesting, right? So you'll recall that, again, the universe is about 13.8 billion years old. And there was just a lot of just nothing for a long time. And then at about 4.6 billion years ago is when the Earth formed. And it would have been hot and just rock and water vapor and things. But then about 3.8 billion years ago, that's when the first life evolved. And life has been evolving for 3.8 billion years. And like I said, to help you understand this concept, 3.8 billion years, like, can you wrap your head around that? You need to figure out a way to apply the proper scale. So again, earlier I mentioned a globe, right? You can look at a globe and you can understand the Earth and the relationship of places on the Earth, the typical globe is about a 1 to 40 million scale. But by scaling things down, you're able to wrap your brain around them. So you can do this. You can use things and scale a big number to something that you can understand. So the way we like to do this in biology is to scale the age of the Earth to 1 day. That's how we can kind of wrap our brain around this. And so that would mean that at midnight would represent when the Earth formed. And then, 11:59:59, so midnight of the following day, 24 hours later, that's the present time. So 24 hours represents 4.6 billion years. That's how we're going to scale this. And so if we do it that way, that means every minute is about 3,125,000 years. So think about 1 minute, and that's the equivalent to 3 million years. That's still a crazy amount of time. That means that every second is 52,000 years if we scale the age of the Earth to 1 day. So 1001. There, 52,000 years just went by. 1001. There's another 52,000 years. How long is human, written human history? A few thousand years, right? And in a second, we go way past that. We go 50,000 years. And so if you think about it and scale it that way, you start to see the enormity of time, like really how long ago the Earth formed. And so this is a figure that I've used for decades now, that I got from a book, and I haven't found anything that I like better, so I continue to use it. But this represents the age of the Earth on a 24-hour time scale. So just kind of take a look at all the different things and relate them to a 24-hour day. And so the formation of the Earth is at midnight, okay? And so you see that the oldest fossils, the oldest prokaryotes, would have been about 5 in the morning. So if the Earth forms at midnight, about 5 in the morning is when life first shows up on Earth, okay? And then you see the first photosynthetic organisms were a little bit after that, about 6, around breakfast time. Now, if the Earth forms at midnight, you don't get free oxygen in the atmosphere until after lunch, until about 1 o'clock. And so this is an important process in the evolution of living things. The earliest life was prokaryotic. It was bacteria. And it was nothing but bacteria, simple one-celled organisms. And oxygen was toxic to these earlier organisms. But once photosynthetic organisms evolved and started giving off oxygen, it took a tremendous amount of time until there was a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere, which would have been toxic to earlier organisms, but that allowed lots of other organisms to evolve. Now, you don't get the first eukaryotic fossils until around 4 or 5 o'clock in the evening. And so again, if the Earth formed at midnight, you get the first life around 5 in the morning, and that's bacteria, prokaryotic organisms. And that's all you have until almost supper time. So most of the history of Earth is just those prokaryotic organisms. Now, you don't get multicellular eukaryotes until around 8 or 9 in the evening. So, eukaryotic organisms don't evolve until 4 or 5, but they're still single-celled. You don't get multicellular life until 8 or 9 in the evening. You don't get plants on land until 9 or 10. The dinosaurs, which you're very familiar with the dinosaurs and their fossil record, the age of dinosaurs would have been from about 10 to about 11 o'clock, all right? And then you see that our species does not show up on this clock until 11:59 and 30 seconds. So if the Earth formed at midnight last night, it's not until 30 seconds before midnight tonight till our species shows up. So again, try and apply this scale and wrap your head around this idea of how long life has been evolving and how long life was unicellular. Prokaryotes for most of the history of life, and then single-celled eukaryotes for a shorter period of time, and multicellular organisms have not been around that long. So that's pretty cool when you think about that. And so I'll leave you with a quote. This is Stephen Jay Gould is a famous evolutionary biologist, and this is him quoting someone else, John McPhee. But he says, consider the Earth's history. I consider a different way to scale these things, right? We just scaled it to 24 hours. But he's saying, consider the Earth's history as the old measure of the English yard, which is the distance from the king's nose to the tip of his outstretched hand. So if that represented all of Earth's history, one stroke of a nail file would erase all of human history. That's how little time our species has been on Earth relative to the age of the Earth. Now that's pretty cool. And it kind of blows your mind a little bit, but that's a good thing. So anyway, that's, again, our overview of the history of life on Earth, the history of Earth itself, some introduction into ways that we try to estimate the age of these things. Again, we're there's a lot more we could talk about here, but I just think that this is really fascinating and interesting. So anyway, as always, if you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I will talk to you later. Have a good day.